The world had always been a place of endless possibility, until it wasn't. The sun rose and fell just like it always had. The sky remained the same and the seas kept their course. But something deep beneath the surface was changing. A quiet, creeping force, unnoticed at first, had begun to spread across the earth. And in the midst of all that was familiar, humans, the creators of history, the dreamers, the adventurers, stood at the brink of their own extinction. In the final days they had no choice but to fight, not just for survival but for everything they had ever believed in. Their most primal instincts awakened and they became something new, something more. But in doing so they paid the price. Their world, their home was gone. Now, the last humans are scattered across a barren, broken landscape, battling not only the remnants of their enemies but the relentless weight of their own isolation. They are no longer the masters of the earth. They are ghosts of the past, clinging to a memory of a world that no longer exists. Their struggles are not just physical, they are mental, emotional, spiritual. One of the last warriors, a figure standing in the ruins of what was once a bustling city, looks out into the horizon. His eyes are filled with the burden of memories. Memories of a time when the world was whole, when they had believed in their strength, their unity. A time before the Spellbound warriors came. Before the world became nothing but a battleground. They had all seen the signs but none of them could have known what it would lead to. The humans had been warned. There were whispers, rumors of a power rising in the shadows, something ancient, something far beyond their understanding. But who would listen? Who could? Humanity had always prided itself on its intelligence, its innovation, its ability to bend the world to its will, to overcome every challenge that had been thrown their way. But they had underestimated the Spellbound warriors. At first, they had seemed like nothing more than a distant legend, a tale told in hushed voices by old men around campfires. But soon, those whispers became something else. They became a shadow in every corner of every city. The warriors did not come to make peace. They came to conquer. They came to destroy everything humanity had built. And they had succeeded. But there were survivors. Few but enough to keep the spark of hope alive. Enough to keep fighting. Among them was a group of humans who refused to fall to the darkness. They were the last of the warriors. They had fought back against the invaders with every weapon they could muster. But it wasn't enough. The Spellbound warriors were too powerful, too relentless. Their magic was beyond comprehension, and their strength seemed infinite. No matter how hard the humans fought, no matter how much they bled, they were slowly being driven to the edge of extinction. The warrior who stood on the edge of the broken city wasn't alone, though. His companions, the few who had survived the brutal wars, stood behind him. They had all lost something dear, along the way. Some had lost family. Others had lost friends. And one, the youngest of the group, had lost everything. But there was a fire in their eyes. A shared determination. They knew the truth. Humanity was the last line of defense against the forces that sought to destroy everything. They were the last hope, the final stand. The warrior turned away from the horizon, his gaze falling on his companions. There was no time to waste. They were on the brink of something much larger than themselves. The last survivors of humanity were not just fighting for their own survival anymore. They were fighting for the future, fighting to ensure that humanity's light would never be extinguished, no matter how dark the world became. The warrior stepped forward, his heart pounding. He knew the task that lay ahead of them, and though fear gnawed at him, it was nothing compared to the greater fear, the fear of what would happen if they didn't try. Behind him, the others were ready. They were all that remained of humanity's last defenders. They had been born to fight, to protect their home, their people, their world. But they were tired, exhausted. Every battle they had fought had left scars, physical and emotional. They had seen their friends fall one by one. But they had never stopped fighting. And they never would. "There is no going back," the warrior whispered, his voice thick with the weight of his words. The youngest warrior, a girl barely in her 20s, looked at him with eyes filled with a burning resolve. She had lost everything in the war. Her family, her friends, even her sense of security. But she had never lost her hope. She had never lost the belief that humanity would rise again. "We keep fighting no matter the cost," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We'll show them what humanity is capable of." The warrior nodded. His hands trembled as he adjusted his weapon. They had fought so many battles and still it wasn't enough. The Spellbound warriors were everywhere. Their magic was beyond anything humanity could understand. The humans had tried every weapon, every strategy. But nothing worked. The Spellbound warriors had the advantage and humanity was on the verge of losing everything. Yet the last warriors refused to give up. Their lives, their survival, had become a testament to everything humanity had once stood for: resilience, courage, and the unyielding drive to overcome any challenge. But as they began to move, a sound reached their ears, a sound that froze them in their tracks. A low, haunting hum, like an ancient force stirring from its slumber. The warriors froze, each of them feeling the weight of something unknown pressing down on them. Something worse than the spellbound warriors. The air seemed to crackle with energy, the ground beneath their feet vibrating as if it was alive. The youngest warrior, her eyes wide, took a step back. She could feel it too, the shift in the atmosphere. Something was coming. And it was bigger, more powerful than anything they had faced before. A figure appeared in the distance, cloaked in shadow. The warriors' hands went to their weapons instinctively, but they didn't move. They couldn't. This wasn't a fight they could win. This was something different. This was the end. Or perhaps the beginning of something far darker. The air grew colder, the energy around them more intense. And the figure began to speak, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. "You think you can defeat us? You think humanity still stands a chance?" The voice whispered, carrying a power that made the ground tremble. The warrior could feel it, an overwhelming force pressing against him. The spellbound warriors had always been powerful, but this was something else. Something ancient. The warrior's heart raced. They had always believed they were the last hope. But now, faced with this new terror, they couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. The figure moved closer, and the warrior's blood ran cold as the shape began to take form, a being unlike anything they had ever seen. Its eyes glowed with a dark, unnatural light. Its presence seemed to fill the air with a suffocating weight. It spoke again, its voice cold, almost mocking. "Humanity bows to no one, but perhaps it should. It's over." The warrior's hands clenched around his weapon, but his thoughts were in turmoil. Could they really still fight? Or was it time to surrender to the inevitable? As the figure took another step, a crackling force surged through the air. And then, everything went black. The last humans stood on the edge of oblivion, facing an enemy they couldn't possibly understand, and a fate that seemed beyond their control. The question remained, could they defy the darkness one last time, or was this the end of humanity's story? The answer was just out of reach. For now, they could only wait for the next battle to begin. The world was a place of chaos now, where every step forward felt like it could be the last. The once thriving cities had become ghost towns, their shattered ruins serving as a reminder of everything humanity had lost. The fight for survival was no longer just about food or shelter. It was about something much more vital. It was about holding on to the very essence of what it meant to be human, to resist the crushing weight of the spellbound warrior's dark magic, and to continue the battle in a world that seemed determined to erase them. The warrior could still feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like an unseen hand pressing down on his chest. The dark figure that had appeared before them, its presence so powerful it made the very earth tremble, was still fresh in his mind. He hadn't seen anything like it before. It wasn't just an enemy, it was a force of nature, something beyond understanding. He tried to shake the fear that crept into his thoughts, but it lingered, gnawing at him, a constant reminder of how out of control they truly were. As he stood there, frozen in the shadows of the ruined city, his mind drifted back to the beginning of it all, the day the world had changed forever. It had started slowly. A whisper here, a rumor there. They had all heard the stories of the spellbound warriors, stories passed down from the old, the ones who had lived through the last great wars. But those were just tales, right? Legends meant to scare children. At least that's what they thought. They had laughed them off, not realizing how deeply the seeds of destruction had already been planted. The first attack had come without warning. One moment they had been going about their business, living their lives, and the next the sky was filled with dark, swirling clouds, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. It wasn't like any storm they had ever known. This wasn't just bad weather. This was something unnatural. The spellbound warriors appeared from the shadows of those clouds, moving with an eerie, almost graceful purpose, like predators stalking their prey. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their presence radiated a power that twisted the very air around them. Their magic was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. It wasn't just the destructive force of it, it was the way they controlled it, as though they had some ancient, forgotten connection to the world itself, something humanity had lost long ago. The warriors had no need for weapons. Their hands alone were enough to rip through metal, stone, and flesh alike. No one was prepared for that kind of power. The world tried to fight back, of course. Humans, ever resilient, tried everything they could to repel the invaders. Weapons of mass destruction, armies of soldiers, every tool of war they had at their disposal, but nothing worked. The warriors didn't even seem to be fazed by it. The human forces, despite their strength, were crushed under the weight of magic they could not comprehend, their resistance nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience to the spellbound invaders. The world fell into chaos. Cities were reduced to rubble in hours. Governments collapsed. People scattered to the corners of the earth, desperately trying to find safety, to find a way to survive. But there was no escape. The warriors were everywhere, and no matter where humanity went, they followed. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, there were those who fought back. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more. Something deep in the human spirit that refused to bow to defeat. They were the last warriors, the last remnants of a civilization that had once been mighty. They were the ones who had seen their homes burned to the ground, their families torn apart, and yet they still stood, still fought. Among them was a woman, her face scarred from years of combat, her hands calloused from gripping weapons that had become an extension of her body. She had lost everything, her home, her loved ones, her peace of mind. But she had never lost her will to fight. She was one of the last generals of the human army, a leader of the resistance. She had seen the worst of what the warriors could do, and yet she had never wavered. She had watched as entire cities fell, as the world around her crumbled, and still she pressed on. Her name didn't matter anymore. Titles and names had become meaningless in a world that no longer recognized the concepts of authority or order. What mattered was the fight for survival, for dignity, for humanity itself. She was one of the few who still believed that they could win, that there was a chance, however slim, to turn the tide. And then there was the boy. He was young, no more than 16, and had only known a world of war and destruction. He had never known peace, never known what it was like to live in a time when the earth wasn't ravaged by chaos. He had lost his family when he was just a child, his parents taken by the warriors, his sister lost in a raid. Since then he had wandered the ruins of what was once a great city, doing whatever he could to survive, hiding from the warriors, running when he could, fighting when he had no other choice. There was a fire in his eyes, a fierce determination that came from knowing nothing but hardship. He didn't have the experience of the older warriors, but he had something they didn't, an unbreakable spirit. He had witnessed the worst of humanity's fall, but he had also seen the moments of hope, the times when the human spirit rose against the darkness. He was a reminder that even in the worst of times, humanity could still fight back. Together, these warriors, broken, scarred, but unyielding, had fought against the spellbound warriors, the invaders who seemed to appear from nowhere and who moved with the power of the earth itself. But no matter how hard they fought, no matter how many battles they won, the warriors only seemed to grow stronger. And the people they had once been, those who had fought beside them, those who had believed in a future, had slowly faded away. The world was broken, and with each passing day, the hope of a future where humanity could rise again seemed more and more impossible. Yet still they fought. Not just for themselves but for what they had once been. For the legacy of humanity, for the belief that they could push back the darkness. They would not let the spellbound warriors or whatever else lurked in the shadows destroy everything they had worked for. They would fight until their last breath, until every ounce of energy was drained from their bodies. But as the warrior and his companions moved through the ruined city, the feeling of dread lingered in the air. Something was coming. Something worse than what they had faced before. They didn't know it yet, but the darkness that had already taken root in the world was about to deepen. The figure they had seen, the one who spoke of humanity bowing to no one, was just the beginning. They couldn't see it, but there was a new threat rising in the distance. Something far darker. Far more ancient than even the spellbound warriors. Something that could change the course of the war forever. And they were walking straight into its path, unaware of the storm that was about to consume them all. The warrior glanced at the others, his mind racing. He knew that this fight wasn't over. Not yet. But the road ahead was growing darker, and each step they took seemed to carry them closer to a final confrontation. A confrontation they might not survive. But they had no choice. They couldn't stop now. They were humanity's last hope. The boy looked up at him, his face grim, his eyes filled with the same determination. He could feel it too. The weight of what was to come. But the warrior said nothing. There were no words to comfort them now. Only the promise of a fight that would take everything they had, and perhaps more. The silence stretched between them, thick with the knowledge that their survival was no longer guaranteed. They were headed toward an unknown enemy, one whose power surpassed anything they had faced. And though they fought with every ounce of strength they had, they could not shake the feeling that this battle was not theirs to win. And so, with nothing left but their resolve, They moved forward into the unknown, unsure of what awaited them, but knowing it would be the greatest challenge of their lives. The warrior tightened his grip on his weapon, his heart heavy with the weight of the uncertainty ahead. And as they stepped into the darkness, they all knew, whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. The city stretched out before them, a labyrinth of crumbling stone and twisted metal. Once, it had been a symbol of humanity's triumph, towering structures, bustling streets, a testament to the power they had wielded over the earth. Now it was nothing but a shell, a hollow reminder of the price of survival. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it a faint, eerie hum, like the whisper of something ancient, something that had been waiting. They moved through the streets cautiously, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the debris beneath them. Every corner they turned felt like it could be their last. The city was silent, too silent, as if it was holding its breath. The warrior glanced at his companions, his eyes scanning the shadows that clung to every corner, every broken building. The feeling of unease was growing stronger by the minute. Something was watching them. Something that didn't belong in this world. The boy, his face set in a grim mask of determination, walked beside him. He had grown up in a world of fear, but now he felt a different kind of fear. A primal kind, the kind that gnawed at your insides, telling you that danger was close but you didn't know where it was coming from. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a warning, a signal that they were not alone. The woman, the general, walked just behind them, her eyes sharp, constantly scanning their surroundings. Her hands were steady, but the grip on her weapon was tighter than it had ever been. She didn't speak, but the tension in the air was thick enough to make every breath feel like it could be their last. There was a sense of foreboding that none of them could shake. The warriors who had come before them, those who had fought and died for humanity's survival, had never faced anything like this. The magic that the invaders wielded was different now. It was no longer just a force that destroyed, it was something that corrupted, something that twisted the very nature of the world. It was as though the earth itself had begun to turn against them. They reached the heart of the city, where the ruins were even more severe. The central tower, once the crown jewel of their civilization, stood broken, its massive structure now little more than a skeletal frame reaching toward the sky. The clouds above had grown darker, swirling with a sense of menace, as if the very heavens were about to collapse on top of them. The air was charged, crackling with an energy that none of them understood. The warrior stopped, his senses on high alert. Something was wrong. The city felt alive, as though it had a heartbeat, a pulse that was growing stronger with every passing second. He could feel it in his bones, the faint tremor of the ground beneath his feet, the eerie hum that seemed to come from all around them. He knew they were close. But close to what? Without warning, a flash of light erupted from the top of the tower, blinding in its intensity. The sky above seemed to rip open, revealing a churning mass of shadows, swirling and twisting like something alive. The hum grew louder, now a deafening roar that reverberated through their very bones. The ground trembled violently, and they were forced to brace themselves, each of them struggling to maintain their footing. The boy's eyes widened in terror as he saw the shadows take shape, dark, formless figures emerging from the rift, moving with a speed and grace that defied logic. They were the warriors, but not like any they had faced before. These were not the mindless killers they had fought in the past. No, these were something more, something ancient. The general's voice broke the silence, sharp and commanding. "We have to move now." But even as the words left her mouth, the figures began to close in around them. The warrior's heart pounded in his chest as he felt the oppressive weight of the magic pressing down on them, crushing the air from his lungs. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The boy drew his weapon, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. His eyes darted around, but the shadows were everywhere, closing in from all sides. He could hear the whispers now, voices that seemed to speak directly into his mind, cold and cruel, promising destruction. "We need to fight," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the magic. He didn't know if he could, but what else could they do? They couldn't give up now. Not after everything they had been through. The general stepped forward, her weapon raised, but her face was pale. She didn't know what these new warriors were, but she knew that they were something beyond their understanding. She had seen the darkness take many forms, but this was different. The air itself seemed to resist them, like the world itself was conspiring against them. The warrior gripped his weapon tightly, his knuckles white. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady despite the storm that raged around them. He didn't know how they would survive this, but he knew one thing for sure. If they were going to die, they would do it on their feet, fighting. Suddenly, the first of the shadowy figures lunged at them, its movements a blur, faster than anything they had ever seen. The warrior swung his weapon, but the figure effortlessly dodged, its form flickering in and out of sight. The boy's shot missed as well, the bullet tearing through the empty air where the figure had just been. The ground beneath them cracked open, and from the gaping hole, more figures poured out, surrounding them. The warriors were everywhere now, their forms twisting in and out of the shadows, their eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. They were closing in, hemming them in from every direction. The general let out a battle cry, charging forward, but the moment her feet left the ground, the air around her seemed to solidify, pulling her back, trapping her in place. She struggled, her body straining against the invisible force that held her in place, but it was no use. The shadows surrounded her. And for a moment she was lost in the darkness. The boy reached out to her, but before he could react, a shadowy hand grasped his wrist, yanking him off balance. He fell hard to the ground, his head spinning. His weapon clattered from his hand, lost in the debris around him. Panic rose in his chest, but he fought it back. He had to focus. He couldn't let fear take over. The warrior turned, his eyes locked on the figures closing in on him. They were faster, stronger, and their magic seemed to be everywhere, twisting the very air around them. He had never felt so helpless, so outmatched. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't let everything they had fought for slip away. The roar of the storm around them grew louder, the shadows closing in like a wave about to crash over them. The warrior's heart raced as he tried to keep his focus, to hold on to the one thing that had kept him alive all this time, hope. But as the figures loomed closer, their eyes glowing brighter with every passing second, he knew the time for hope was running out. There was no escape, no way out. They were surrounded, trapped in the heart of the storm, and the darkness was closing in fast. And then, just as all seemed lost, a voice rang out through the chaos, a voice that cut through the roaring wind and the blinding light. It was familiar, and yet, it sent a chill down the warrior's spine. The voice of the one who had led them into this darkness. It was too late to turn back now. They were in the final moments of the battle, and the world they knew was about to change forever. The voice echoed through the chaos, chilling the warrior's blood. It wasn't just any voice, it was one he had never expected to hear again, not after everything they had gone through. His head snapped around, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. In the midst of the swirling darkness, a figure emerged, stepping out from the shadows with an unnatural grace. The warrior's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the silhouette. It was her. The woman they had lost. The one who had fought by their side, the one whose death had spurred them on, whose memory had driven them to this point. Oh, how was she here? The last he saw, her body had been consumed by the magic, torn apart in an explosion of light and darkness. But now, here she was, standing in the center of the storm, her eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Her form shimmered like a mirage, half-formed as though she were a being caught between worlds. Her presence filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread and disbelief. This couldn't be real. He had seen her die. He had felt the finality of it, the crushing weight of loss that had shattered them all. But here she was, impossibly alive, surrounded by the same shadows that were trying to tear them apart. The boy's voice cracked as he called out, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. No, it can't be you. The figure, this impossibility, turned to face them, her face a mask of sorrow and something far darker. It is me, she said, her voice hollow and distant. But it's not the same me. Not anymore. The warrior felt his heart sink into his stomach as the shadows seemed to close in around her, wrapping themselves around her form, twisting it further. She wasn't the person they had known. This was something else. Something worse. The air around them grew heavier, the very atmosphere suffocating as the other figures seemed to bow toward her, drawn to her presence like moths to a flame. She was the key, the catalyst that had set everything into motion, and now, in this twisted form, she was the force holding the darkness together. What are you? The general's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension that filled the air. She stepped forward, her weapon raised, but her eyes betrayed the doubt creeping into her mind. Could this really be her? The woman they had lost? The woman who had led them to victory? The woman, no, the thing that wore her face, tilted her head, an almost sadistic smile playing at the corners of her lips. I am what remains when humanity's last hope falls. I am the answer to the question you never thought to ask. I am what you've made of me. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, feeding off her words, growing stronger, more tangible. It was like they were alive, a force that thrived on the despair and confusion in the air. The warrior's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This was all wrong. They had come so far, fought so hard, and now the one person they had trusted, the one person they had fought to protect, had become something else entirely. Something that could destroy them all. "I don't understand," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm of magic. "What? Why are you doing this?" The figure's expression softened for a brief moment, and for a heartbeat, the warrior thought he saw the flicker of the woman they had lost. But then it was gone, replaced by a cruel emptiness. "Because, boy, you've always looked at this world through the wrong eyes. You fought for the wrong reasons. You believed you could save it. But the truth is, this world was never meant to be saved." The words hit like a physical blow, leaving the warrior staggering. He could feel the weight of them sinking into his chest. All this time, all the battles, all the sacrifice, was it for nothing? The general stepped forward again, her eyes narrowed in fury. "You think you know everything, don't you? That just because we've been pushed to the edge, we'll fall in line with whatever dark fantasy you've concocted. But we're still here. We're still standing. And we won't give up." But even as she spoke, the ground trembled beneath them, and the shadows grew stronger, more aggressive. It was as if the very earth itself was rejecting their resistance. The boy clenched his fists, feeling the pull of despair threatening to drag him under. He couldn't let it happen. Not now, not after everything. He had to believe in humanity's strength. He had to believe in the strength that had carried them this far, no matter the cost. The warrior's eyes locked onto the figure, the one who once had been their leader, their ally, their friend. "What did they do to you?" he asked, his voice low and filled with pain. Her eyes, those eyes that once held warmth and hope, were now cold, empty. "What they did to me," she echoed as though the words were foreign to her. "They freed me. They gave me the power to see the truth. To see that humanity's path was always leading here, toward destruction, toward darkness. You think you've won because you can still breathe, but you haven't. You're just delaying the inevitable. The world will burn and you will be nothing but ash." Her voice, cold and harsh, was like ice water poured over their hearts. The warrior's mind spun. This couldn't be the end. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. They weren't supposed to fall here, not like this, not with everything they had sacrificed. And then, as if in answer to her words, the shadows surged forward. The ground cracked open, and from the rift, more figures emerged, warriors twisted by the same dark power, their forms more monstrous than ever. They were no longer just fighters. They were nightmares, born from the very magic that had torn apart the world they once knew. The warrior's breath hitched as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a battle. This was something far worse than they had imagined. The darkness wasn't just a force to be fought, it was a living, breathing thing, and they had awakened it. It had always been here, lying dormant, feeding off their fears, their regrets, their mistakes. The boy's eyes were wide with horror as he backed away, his mind racing. What do we do now?" The general's voice was hard, her resolve unwavering. "We fight," she said, her gaze never leaving the woman in front of them. "We fight and we hold on. Because if we don't, everything we've done, everything we've fought for, it dies with us." But even as she spoke those words, the shadows tightened around them, and the air grew thick with the promise of something far worse. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for the very soul of humanity. The warrior looked at the others, their faces pale, but their eyes burning with the same determination. They had come so far and now they would have to face the impossible. Because humanity, no matter how small, how broken, would bow to no one. Not today, not ever. And as the darkness closed in, the warrior knew one thing for sure. They weren't just fighting for the world. They were fighting for the future, for hope, for everything they had lost and everything they still had left to lose. The air around them vibrated with tension, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on their very souls. The shadows loomed, dark and suffocating, swirling like hungry beasts ready to devour them whole. The woman, the one they had once fought alongside, stood before them, a figure not of flesh and bone but of pure, terrifying power. The warrior's chest tightened, his grip on his weapon shaking with the realization of what had to be done. They had no choice but to fight, to destroy the very person they had once trusted. But was it even her anymore? What had she become? Her voice rang out again, cold and mocking, a twisted reflection of the warmth that had once been in her words. "You still think you can save this world? How quaint. But I am beyond saving now, just as this world is." The shadows seemed to grow taller, more menacing, swirling around her like a cloak of despair. But even as she spoke there was a flicker of something else, something human. A part of her, buried deep inside, was still fighting, still holding on to the memories of who she had been. The warrior saw it, a brief moment of hesitation, a crack in the armor she had forged. "You're not her," he said, his voice raw with emotion. You're not the person we fought beside. You're a prisoner of this darkness. And we won't let it take you. She flinched, her eyes momentarily softening. But the moment passed and the cruel smile returned. You don't understand. I've seen the truth. There's no going back. I am what this world needs now. I am its salvation. The warrior shook his head, his heart breaking. No, you're wrong. We are humanity's salvation. Not this. The general stepped forward, her weapon raised, but her voice was filled with sorrow. You are our hope. You are our hope. But not like this. The figure before them, this twisted version of the woman they had lost, laughed, the sound hollow and distant. Hope is a lie. A fleeting thing. You think that by fighting, by clinging to this idea of humanity's strength, you can change the world. But all you do is delay the inevitable. Her words hung in the air, thick with finality. But then something unexpected happened. The boy, trembling with fear but burning with the same resolve, took a step forward. Maybe hope is a lie, he said, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at him. But we're still here. And as long as we're here, we'll fight. We'll fight because we have something worth fighting for. For a brief moment, the darkness seemed to falter, just the slightest ripple in its oppressive grip. The shadows recoiled, as if recoiling from the light that still burned within them. It wasn't much. But it was enough. The warrior saw it then, the last shred of humanity struggling to break free from the abyss. He knew what he had to do. With a surge of strength, he lunged forward, his weapon raised high, ready to strike. But as he did, the shadows around the woman surged forward, faster than he could react. And in that moment of hesitation, the final twist hit like a thunderclap. The woman, the thing that wore her face, let out a scream, but it wasn't her voice anymore. It was a guttural, inhuman sound, a wail of anguish and fury combined. The shadows shifted, and in an instant the very fabric of reality seemed to twist and tear. The warrior's eyes widened in horror as the figure before him began to distort, her body warping and unraveling as though she were made of smoke, as if the very essence of her was being consumed by the darkness itself. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the truth was revealed. The woman, the one they had thought to be their ally, their leader, had never been truly alive. She had been a puppet, a vessel for something far darker, far more ancient. She had been a sacrifice, her body the price for the return of something long buried beneath the earth. The darkness wasn't just a force, it was an entity, a being that had been waiting for its moment to emerge, to reclaim the world that once belonged to it. It had used her, twisted her, and in the end, it was her, not the warriors, who had become the true key to the darkness's reign. The boy's voice cracked, his heart shattered as the realization hit him. We were too late. She was never our hope. She was its weapon. The general's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat as she watched the nightmare unfold. No. This can't be. But it was too late. The shadows surged, consuming everything in their path. The very ground beneath them began to shake, as though the earth itself was being torn apart. The warrior tried to move, tried to act, but he was frozen, unable to look away from the nightmare unfolding before him. The woman's form disintegrated entirely, leaving behind only a swirling mass of darkness that roared like a beast released from its chains. The shadows gathered, forming into a shape more monstrous than any of them could have imagined. It was no longer just a force of destruction. It was alive, sentient, and now it was free. The warrior could feel the cold presence of the entity pressing against his mind, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush him. It was power, pure and unrelenting. And it wanted everything. We failed, the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. We thought we could win. We thought we could save her, but we couldn't even save ourselves. The general's hand trembled, her weapon slipping from her grip as the realization set in. They had been too caught up in their fight, too focused on the woman they had once known. They hadn't seen the truth until it was too late. The entity was here and now they were the ones being hunted. But even as the darkness pressed closer, even as the shadows seemed to rise up to swallow them whole, something deep within the warrior stirred. He knew that this wasn't over. Not yet. Humanity had always been more than the sum of its struggles. It had always found a way to survive, to fight against the odds. They weren't finished. Not yet. And with that final desperate thought, the warrior raised his eyes toward the rising storm, knowing that the battle was far from over. The enemy might have won this round, but humanity's greatest strength, its defiance, its resilience, would burn through the darkness. They had just one last chance. One last fight. The storm raged around them, a fury of shadows and darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The ground cracked and splintered, as if the very world itself was coming apart at the seams. But through it all, one truth remained. The warriors stood together, side by side, not as individuals but as the last remnants of humanity, holding their ground against the overwhelming darkness that threatened to swallow everything. The warrior's breath was ragged, his body exhausted, but his heart burned with something stronger than fear, something that had always burned within the human spirit: hope. The boy's hand trembled at his side, but his eyes were bright, filled with an unspoken promise. The general, though visibly shaken, stood tall, her eyes narrowed in defiance. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future. For the lives that would come after them. For all those who had been lost. "We still have a chance," the warrior said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. His words rang out in the air, louder than the growls of the entity that surrounded them, louder than the crackling of the earth breaking apart. "We've faced worse. We've always found a way." The general turned to him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. A glimmer of understanding passed between them. They had been down this road before. Time and time again humanity had fought against insurmountable odds, against enemies who sought to crush them. And every time they had refused to give up. They had always found a way to rise again no matter the cost. "Then we fight," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. The boy nodded, his fear replaced by something else, something powerful, something human. "We fight," he whispered. They all knew the stakes. The darkness they faced was no longer just an enemy, it was a force of nature, ancient and hungry. But in that moment something changed. They weren't just standing against the unknown anymore. They were standing together. They were fighting for something greater than their own survival. The warrior raised his weapon, his eyes fixed on the swirling mass of shadows that loomed before them. It had taken everything from them, every ounce of strength, every shred of hope. But it had underestimated humanity's greatest weapon: unity. Together they charged. The ground beneath them trembled as they ran, the air heavy with the weight of the storm. The warrior's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't fear that drove him anymore. It was the belief that they could win. That they had to win. Not just for themselves but for the future. For the generations that would come after them. The darkness lashed out, tendrils of shadow reaching for them, but they fought back with every ounce of strength they had. The boy's eyes were filled with determination as he swung his weapon, cutting through the dark, while the general moved with deadly precision, her every strike calculated and perfect. The warrior's heart raced as he fought alongside them, every movement a testament to humanity's strength, to its refusal to give in. But the entity was relentless. It pressed harder, faster, wrapping itself around them, squeezing the life from everything it touched. The warrior felt it pulling at his mind, at his very soul, trying to erase him. Trying to break him. And for a moment it almost worked. His vision blurred, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the darkness wrapped itself tighter around him. His knees buckled and he fell to the ground, his weapon slipping from his hand. He could feel the cold, the crushing weight of despair bearing down on him. For a moment he thought he was done, that it was all over. But then, through the haze of darkness, he heard it. A voice. It wasn't the entity's voice. It was the boy's voice. Strong, unwavering. "We can't stop," the boy shouted, his words cutting through the storm. "We can't stop fighting. Not now. Not ever." The warrior's eyes fluttered open and he saw the boy standing tall, his eyes filled with fire. The general was beside him, her eyes locked onto the darkness, her weapon raised high. They were still standing, still fighting. And in that moment the warrior understood. It wasn't about how strong they were. It wasn't about how many battles they had fought. It was about the one thing that had always kept humanity moving forward: the refusal to give up. The warrior pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest, but he ignored it. He couldn't stop. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let the darkness win. With a final roar, he grabbed his weapon and charged, the light of humanity's spirit burning brighter than the storm itself. They fought together, not as warriors, not as soldiers, but as the last hope of a species that had endured everything and had never once surrendered. And as they fought, the darkness began to waver. It shuddered, recoiling from the force of their defiance. The shadows that had once consumed everything now seemed to shrink, to pull back, as if afraid of what they were up against. The warrior could feel it, a shift. The entity once so powerful was weakening. Its grip was loosening, its strength fading with every strike, every blow they landed. The boy was the first to strike the heart of the darkness, his weapon slicing through the tendrils of shadow with a cry that echoed across the land. The general followed, her strike precise, her heart filled with the weight of everything they had lost. And finally, the warrior himself joined them, his weapon cutting through the last remnants of the storm. The darkness shrieked, an inhuman sound that seemed to rattle the very air. And then, with a final desperate roar, it collapsed. The storm faded, the shadows evaporating into nothingness, leaving only silence in their wake. The ground, once torn apart by the darkness, now lay still, calm as if the world itself was taking a breath. The warrior dropped to his knees, exhausted, his chest heaving with every breath. The boy collapsed beside him, his body trembling with the effort. The general stood a few steps away, her eyes scanning the horizon, her face grim but resolute. "We did it," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. The warrior looked up, his eyes meeting the boy's. For a moment they didn't speak. There was no need to. The battle was over. They had won. But the world was not the same as it had been before. They had lost so much. The cost of this victory had been steep, and the scars of their struggle would never truly fade. The woman they had once known was gone, replaced by something else, something twisted and broken. But in the end they had saved humanity. They had fought for the future, for the very essence of what it meant to be human. "Yeah," the warrior said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did." The general turned to face them, her eyes full of unspoken words. She didn't need to say anything. The weight of what they had all been through, the sacrifice, the pain, it was all there in the silence between them. But there was something else there too. Hope. It was fragile, but it was there. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. They had won. And they would rebuild. The world was theirs to reclaim. And they would never stop fighting for it,